Welcome to Broadway Drumming 101. My guest today is Bill Hayes, and I just want to let you know that Bill Hayes has something in common with these two people that really have almost nothing to do with each other. Liza Minnelli and KORN. Two people that Bill Hayes has played with, amongst others, and he's also done about 60 Broadway shows. 60 Broadway and off-Broadway shows, or 60 Broadway shows?
60, actually more than 60 Broadway shows.
My goodness. Welcome to the podcast, ladies and gentlemen, Bill Hayes.
Well, thank you, Clayton. Clayton, nice to see you. And I've done quite a lot of Broadway shows. One of the things that I'm really happy about is I was able to keep a Broadway career going while still working with some of those people that you were talking about. I hooked up with Liza Minnelli when I was 27 years old. And it turned out to be basically a lifelong gig. She had a 12-piece band and was very loyal to us and toured all over the world all the time. We used to go to Las Vegas 5 times a year for about 25 years.
Wow.
And some years were busy, some years not, but it was always a little something, So that was quite a ride.
Liza Minnelli, Barbra Streisand, Frank Sinatra, Audra McDonald, KORN.
Which one of these is not like the other?
So what got you into becoming a percussionist / drummer?
Well, I had always been interested in music. I took piano lessons from my aunt when I was in kindergarten. So I came to it kind of early. But I got interested in drums around junior high school. Got my first drum set. And my first band, oddly enough, I was into Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass, and my first band was a Tijuana Brass style band.
Really?
Yeah. We cleverly called it the Barcelona Brass. thinking that was really hip. I don't know. It was 9th grade. What did I know? But I was always also, my family liked to go to shows, so I had seen some shows and thought they were an intriguing thing. When I got to high school, we had a great drama director who I got involved with, and he's had me music direct a couple of shows in high school. So that's when I started getting into the show thing. I was playing drums then, and I actually played saxophone in the band for a little while, but then I finally convinced him to let me switch to drums. And when I was in high school, I lived in the Boston area, so I was lucky to get to study with Alan Dawson while I was in high school.
Oh, nice.
It was cool. And then I went to Hart, and like so many of us do when we think we're going to be drummers, we go and start learning percussion and get excited about other things. Actually, my high school band director was a vibist, Jack Hahn. He was a terrific jazz vibist. So we had vibes and xylophone at the school, so I started playing mallets when I was about a junior in high school and got into that too. So by the time I got to Hart, I was sort of into that and continued with that. And then the great Gary Burton came down there for a little while, and I studied with him for a couple of years. And the guy at Hart was Al Lepak, who literally wrote the book on timpani. So I was just very lucky to really get great training early on. And, it opened a lot of doors, but, it's interesting trying to juggle all that stuff. But, I've always been a little schizophrenic, so it worked for me. Little of this, little of that.
You grew up in the Boston area. What made you decide to go to Hart School of Music?
Well, I was studying at Berkeley while I was in high school, and it might have seemed a logical progression to go there. But for one thing, I had that kind of youthful wanderlust that I wanted to get out of town. And my high school band director had been hearing great things about Hart. He kind of recommended it to me. So I auditioned a few places, but when I went to Hart and met Al Lepak, I really liked him. It just seemed like the right fit. And it's hard to say exactly what the final decision was, but that's where I ended up, and I had a great time, and he turned out to be great. And as it happens, he was a guy who trained a lot of the people who came both to Broadway and to the LA studios. So he has quite a great track record of turning out students that actually do stuff.
Were there specific drummers that you were looking up to when you were in your formative years that you you were trying to emulate?
Sure. I was an early fan of Buddy Rich and loved those albums. The Mercy Mercy album like knocked me out. And the Buddy Rich Max Roach dual album got me into Max Roach. And I loved him. I still think he's one of the most musical drummers ever, and I love his whole approach to soloing, to actually not just showing off your chops, but actually saying something in solos. He had a profound influence on me, I think. And Alan Dawson, when he was, when I started studying with him, I was already aware of the Dave Brubeck quartet that he played in, the second quartet with him and Jack Six and Jerry Mulligan. And those were some great records. And those were some of my early inspirations, those three guys.
Did you want to be a jazz drummer, or did you see Broadway as, where you wanted to be?
Well, it's interesting. Back in those early days, I was into jazz and I wanted to be a jazz drummer. I was also into rock and wanted to be a rock drummer. But I loved doing shows, and I found that, when I started being old enough to go out, the things I liked going out to the most were jazz clubs and shows. So I was interested in whatever could bring me to those places, and I fooled around with acting a little bit in those early days too. So I was attracted to the theater. It was one of my goals to be in the theater, but one of the reasons I decided to come to New York was I wanted a place where I could do a bunch of different stuff, and that seemed like the place.
When you came to New York City in the 80s, were you intimidated by the size and the amount of people that were here and the amount of great musicians, or were you just like, I'm going to take this head on?
I think I don't know if the word intimidate is right, but certainly in awe. There was a lot going on, and I wondered how I would get into it. But I was excited. Mostly, I realized, another thing happened when I was in college. I heard about Ian Finkel, the great xylophone player, and I called him up, because you could do that back then. I called him up and said I'd like to take a few lessons. So I started, when I was still in college, I came down to New York and took a couple lessons with Ian. And on those trips into New York, I started realizing every time I drove into Manhattan, this kind of wave of excitement came over me. And about the third or fourth time that happened, I thought, maybe this is where I need to be. So I was more excited about it than anything else. But yeah, overwhelmed, certainly,
And you immediately started reaching out to people that worked on Broadway, or like, what did you do musically in New York?
Well, this is an interesting detour because when I got here, I just came and had no idea what to do. I had played a dinner theater in Connecticut when I was still in college, and a year after, I was actually kept working there because I was playing shows in Connecticut. And I met a few people who said, call me. So I called one of them, and, he was doing cruise ships, and that's not what I wanted to do. So I didn't go for that. And within a few weeks of being here, a friend of mine said, there's somebody looking for a drummer. There's a show that's going to go out. Well, this show turned out to be a comedy burlesque show, definitely not a Broadway tour. And I went and auditioned for this guy, this piano player named Charlie Burgess. And they hired me, and the next week I left and ended up leaving for 3 years.
Wow.
So I was playing drums, and I was playing these shows, and I had never been out of the Northeast in my life. And my wanderlust was severe. And we went to Phoenix, and we went to LA, and Kentucky, and all over the place. And after traveling around the country for about almost 2 years, we ended up in Reno, Nevada, and stayed there for a year. So I lived in Reno for a year, having a great time. I have some wild stories about Reno, but I think I'll probably have to save them for the book. And then eventually, when that year was over and the show went on, I said, okay, I got to get out of here, because otherwise I'm going to be doing this show for the rest of my life. And I had a girlfriend in the show, so, it was hard to leave, but I did. And I said, it's time to go back to New York. I came back to New York. And that is when I finally, several years after the fact, got a hold of one of the music directors I had worked at one of the dinner theaters in Connecticut with. And he told me to call the conductor at Danson, the original Danson on Broadway, which had already been running several years, but it was still going. And so I did, and he said, come on down and meet our drummer and talk to him. So my first time ever going into a Broadway pit, I was going to go meet Alan Herman. He was playing drums for the original Danson. And I walk in, and he's hanging from a bar, shirtless, with a giant guy pounding him in the stomach. This is my first encounter with a Broadway drummer. And as the guy hits him in the stomach, he says, harder, harder. And he's banging him in the stomach. And he says, see, I told you I could take it. And then he looks over at me and he lets go and he drops down to the floor. And I'm thinking, okay, I'm not sure I'm ready for these guys.
Did he invite you to get up there so you can get beat too?
He did not. And that's good because I would have had to turn around and run away. And he told me he didn't need any subs, but there were two percussionists and they both needed some subs. And would I be interested in watching them? So that was it. That was my first sub. So
after Danson, when did you get a chance to finally get your own show? Did you start subbing at other shows after that, or was it a situation where you got your own show after a short period?
I had a couple more subs after that. There was a West Side Story in town at the time, and that was a serious book, and I went and did that. That's where I met. I was playing percussion, and Nick Serrato was playing drums, and Nick became a real mentor for me. He really helped me out, and when they're playing our song, needed a sub, Nick recommended me, and they took me over there, which is where I met Michael Keller, which turned out to be a great relationship. He would later be the contractor for Barbra Streisand and many other things that I got to do. So I subbed several shows, and after a couple of years, I was thinking, it's about time I got my own, and I didn't quite see the connection, how that was going to happen. But after a few years, it did happen. I would say 2 or 3 years of subbing, and then I finally got one. And then they started to come every now and then. You don't always know. It's like you think you're going to get in and you're just going to go from show to show. And I have quite a record. I can't say that I didn't do that, but it didn't feel like that all the time. Sometimes you get a couple things in a row and then nothing for a year or two, and you never really know what's coming next. I mean, I think you can't really do this life if you don't kind of thrive on that kind of excitement and lack of certainty. But it took a while before it felt like I was really in a regular part of the scene.
Yeah, one of the things I ask certain other people is how do you deal with uncertainty as a drummer / percussionist in New York City?
Well, it's an excellent question because you're always going to deal with it if you're a player or you're pretty much anything in the performing world. I'm not sure the way I deal with it is something I would recommend to people, especially today, because when I first got here, it was possible to get a really cheap apartment in New York, and that's no longer really possible. But it meant that if I was desperate, I could go play the vibes on the street and make enough money to, pay a bill or two. Rents aren't such as that's possible anymore, so you need a little bit more firm financial basis. The way I dealt with it was to keep focused on what I was doing and not get sidetracked into anything else. And while I recommend that, I understand it's not entirely possible for everybody. But I never really did anything else that wasn't music related. I did, I had a friend who was doing cable TV shows that needed somebody to do score reading, like concert shows, and you would call cameras and stuff like that. So I would veer off into things like that if I got the opportunity, and various other music-related things, but I never really entertained the possibility of doing anything else. So my low periods were pretty low because I didn't have anything going on sometimes, but my high periods were high and they were doing what I wanted to do. So that's how I dealt with it. I dealt with it by dealing with the downs and just, keeping it together and keep practicing and keep working and making sure that when I did get an opportunity, I was as good as I could be.
When you were in your down period, did you ever get thoughts of, you know what, I don't know if I want to do this anymore?
I knew I wanted to do it, so I don't think I ever thought of not actually doing it. But in terms of, did I ever think of maybe making a living somehow else? Sure, those thoughts crossed my mind. And then I tried to figure out what that would be, and they quickly faded because I really didn't think I could do anything else. Also, I'm not a morning person, so an office job never really seemed like a good idea to me.
So you never had 8 a.m. classes at Hart?
Maybe there were. I'm not sure I made them all. I don't remember there being 8 a.m.s. I mean, I really don't remember much about that, so maybe there were. There was a 9 a.m. class that the entire school was supposed to go to at Hart called musicianship, where the director of the school would watch people perform and then critique them in front of the entire student body, which was cool. Actually, it was kind of interesting, and it gave you a performance opportunity and, a chance to get dressed down by a cranky old man who knew a lot of stuff. And they took attendance at that. It was a little hard to pass on that one. So, yeah, I got to that whatever time that was. I don't think it wasn't 8, though. It was either 9 or 10. I tried to schedule my classes as late as possible. But, I did what I had to do. And, in life, you do that. If you have to get up at 8 or you have to get up at 7, you do it, And if I'm, in the modern world, if I have a recording session in the morning, well, that's exciting. So I'll get up for that,
But speaking of, recording sessions in the 80s, were you part of the recording scene back then?
I got here right as the recording scene was starting to fade a little. And I did get sort of the tail end of it a little bit. I got to do a few things. I got to do some jingles for a little while. And I wasn't one of the guys, I wasn't here when there was, jingles every day, all day. But for a couple of years, I did a couple a week, something like that, and that was cool. Great players, interesting people, always exciting to be in a studio. There was a bunch of studios then. So, yeah, that was cool. I thought those gigs were really exciting. When I was out on the road with Liza, the drummer was Bill Livornia, and he had been one of the great recording drummers. He did all the Four Seasons records and Richie Havens and a bunch of other people and movies. He was in the studio all the time. And he said that they used to call the union and say, could you measure my checks? And if it was like less than 2 inches, they wouldn't bother to go in. And
wow.
I never had anything like that ever. If I had like 1 or 2 checks down there, I thought that was pretty exciting. But yeah, so I missed those days, but I caught the very tail end and got a little taste of the studio life. And it was exciting. I really liked it a lot. I mean, obviously we all still go in the studio every now and then and do cast albums or other albums. I've done 3 or 4 records this year. Not on a regular weekly basis like it used to be.
Talking to older musicians that have been in the business of Broadway, coming from the era where you were actually in a pit and you looked at the conductor who was like 15 or 10 feet in front of you, and they were conducting the cast on stage, and you were in an open air pit and you didn't have the monitors or in-ear monitors and and a conductor can. When did you see the transition from the older model of playing in a pit to the way it is today? Was it a gradual thing? Was it like, okay, now we're putting all this stuff in the pit and everybody's going to be mic'd?
It was a gradual thing. It was. First, there came to be a few of the giant old TV monitors for hard to reach places in the pit. Then it became kind of a thing that you would get, the small square, but still, tube TVs that we mounted here and there. And, sometimes it happened, sometimes you didn't. But once that technology came around, it allowed them to do other things like, put half the band over here and half over there. So all of a sudden you'd have a show where everybody had them because it was the only way you could see them. And then there would be shows where maybe some of the band would go up on stage on an elevator. I had a couple of those, and then come back down. And therefore, sometimes you could see the conductor and sometimes you couldn't. So I'm trying to think of when it became a thing. Once the flat screens started to replace the deep screens, then it became pretty ubiquitous pretty quickly. And the original flat screens were awful. They froze up and were a mess. But after a couple of years, they started to get that together. Then they started to build, the pit so that they didn't really care if you could see the conductor or not. Once that happened, it became total pretty quickly, but the build up to that flat screen experience was gradual.
And in your first, few shows, or back in the day, did you have in-ear monitors, or did you have a hotspot, or did you just listen to what was going on?
I had a couple with hotspots. Hotspots were popular early on. In-ears were not a thing yet at that point. A couple of places where there were headphones. Not much was on click in those early days, but every now and then there was a tune or two on click, and the drummer, sometimes the whole rhythm section would have the click, but not really everybody. Let me think. Other than that, there was definitely some shows that had nothing. No monitors. It's interesting because Phantom of the Opera started 36 years ago now, and so it started old school. But they did that with the intent of creating an acoustic operatic setting. So they ripped out all the padding on the floor, made it a hard floor for the orchestra pit, put the entire 27-piece orchestra in the pit, and very minimal miking. I mean, it's obviously everything had to be mic'd, but they tried to make it minimal, like area mics rather than specific instrument mics, and not much in the way of monitors. I'm trying to remember if there was any at first. I don't think there was. I don't think there ever was, actually, and no screens originally. Eventually, as they changed things around, they put screens in for the keyboard players who were right up against the conductor, and one for the timpanist, which was great because the timpanist was facing a wall, and he had to play like that most of the time. I'm talking about this as I subbed there from the beginning and until the end.
Oh wow, really?
It was great because I would go do a show for a year or two and then come back, and Phantom would be exactly the same. Just walk right back in. And those guys were great. They never expanded the pool too much until the very end. And so I would call, if I'd been gone for 2 years, I'd call and say, "Hey, my show's closing next week." They say, "Great, can you do next Thursday?" It was great. So I always had a little backup.
So was there one percussionist or more than one percussionist on that show?
There were two percussionists on that show, and they both did the entire 35-year run.
Really?
Yeah, that's the correct response. Eric Cohen and Jan Hagiwara. And if you haven't heard of them, it's because they've been down on the pit at Phantom for 35 years. But they were, they had the greatest gig in the history of Broadway. I mean, they used it for various reasons. Jan used it to go get like 3 or 4 degrees, and she got herself a job with the Environmental Protection Agency. So she had a daytime job with the EPA, and then would come play shows at night. She did all kinds. A lot of people there did all kinds of things with having that kind of security, like buy homes or put their kids through college and that kind of stuff. But that was an unusual scene down there, and it was nice for them to be loyal to the people who were longtime subs, which they were all the way.
Were they ever tired of playing the show?
Oh yeah. Jan would take off months at a time, every year basically. And but Rick did this. He played the shows all the time, and not only that, because I played both books and I played with both of them. He was unbelievably consistent. In year 27, he would not make a single mistake. I mean, it was really amazing. So I don't know what kind of brain he had that allowed him to do that, but he did a great job all the way.
What's the longest running show that you've ever had?
Well, I've never had one that ran more than 2 years.
Wow, really?
Yeah. Which, 2 years is a good run. It'd be nice to have something longer, but That's the way it goes. The weird thing is, in all the shows I've done, and I've had 4 or 5 that have been 2 years, and a few others that have been close to that. I don't think there's any show I've played more than Phantom.
Wow. And the shows that lasted almost 2 years, did you ever get tired of playing the show?
Generally not. I mean, there are certainly days when it's like, there might be a day when I was tired of it, but in terms of in general, I don't think so. I always want to get it right, and the more you get to know it, I feel like after I've done a show for a year that I do it to a level that I didn't know I could do the year before, and it's fast, and I wonder how I did it the year before. I keep finding new things to do and trying to get it right every night. It's I don't know. I still get excited about that.
There are many things that I'd like to get across on this podcast and on my Broadway Drumming 101 website, is that people want to get into the scene and play shows and may think that they're going to be on Hamilton or Book of Mormon or The Lion King or Phantom, but they're more likely to be on a show that's not going to last very long. And, 2 years at the most of a show running it's good, steady income for those 2 years, but then you're wondering what's going to be coming next. One of the things that people might not know is the fact that most shows don't last long. Did you realize that coming into the business, and were you expecting, all right, this is not going to last very long, so I got to keep my irons in the fire by playing with KORN and Liza Minnelli?
Well, all those things were also exciting to me. I don't think of them as a backup more as much as another exciting thing to do. But I'm not sure I realized much about how Broadway worked, or what the longevity of things was going to be. The fact now, in my wisdom now, I know that most shows don't run. Most shows don't run a year. A lot of shows run between a year and 2 years, and it's considered decent. And if it takes about a year for most shows to make their money back. So if a show runs a year, usually it's considered a hit technically, meaning it made its money back. That varies depending on the show, but. So, yeah, you're right about people thinking, oh, I want my Hamilton or I want my Aladdin or Wicked, and those shows have run forever. But that's really rare. There are probably, 7 or 8 shows right now that are long runs. Nothing, like Phantom. Well, actually, there are things like Phantom, like Chicago is getting up there, and Lion King is getting up there. But out of the last 30 years, that's like 7 shows that have run 10 years. Out of 100, 150 shows. Probably 90 of those 150 shows ran 6 months or less. And, several others did a year to 3 to 5 years. But yeah, a 10-year hit is very rare, and you can't really count on that or expect it. I think it's usually a surprise for most people when that happens. I know the people at Phantom weren't expecting to be there for a lifetime, but they were. It's hard to know what the public is going to latch onto,
When I was out in San Francisco working on the Hippest Trip, the Soul Train musical recently, before we even started, there was a 7:00 meeting. And, you get you get a 7:00 call. It's like, we're meeting at 7:00, and you're like, oh no, what's wrong? The show's going to close. I'm like, wait a minute, we haven't even opened yet, and the show's going to close. But no, it wasn't even about the show closing. It was about some other thing that happened in the theater. But I'm sure you've gotten a lot of those notices, like, Tuesday, you meet and you find out. Do you have the dread of, oh no, what am I going to do now? Or you were kind of expecting it? Like, how have you dealt with those kind of things?
Both of those. You can be expecting it, but when the meeting actually is announced, and that's how it always is. So there'll be a meeting on stage tonight at 7:00. It's always bad when there's a meeting. At least if the show's already running. It's a kick in the gut. It always feels like a kick in the gut, even if it's coming. And sometimes you do. A lot of times you don't. A lot of times you're surprised. I did a show. One of my favorite shows that I did was Amour. It was Michel Legrand's only Broadway show, and I was actually very involved in that. I was the contractor, and there was only 5 musicians and giant parts. Michelle was sitting over us writing music. Here, Bill, try this. And it was like very exciting, very cool. Music changed all day, every day. And I love Michel Legrand. I'd always loved him. I had met him out in Las Vegas because I had gotten invited by Charles Aznavour to go play the opening of the Paris Las Vegas. And it was with him and Michel Legrand and Lynn Renault. And so that was cool. So I had met Charles, and we had a little history. I mean, not Charles, I'm sorry. I had met Michelle. But at any rate, so Michelle, this was beautiful music. I love the music to this show. And what happened was we opened and we got pretty good reviews. Not great, but, this is an interesting show. There was, I mean, I guess damned with faint praise, but it was good reviews, lots of pullable stuff. But the producer was facing a lawsuit from Woody Allen because he said that she had produced some of his movies and not paid the correct royalties or something. He won the lawsuit, and so she had to pull her money from the show and close. So you never know what's going to close your show. So we had the meeting. We had the meeting, not expecting it, saying, "Well, these reviews were good. I wonder how long we'll go." It was like, "Oh, movie, we're closing in 2 weeks," and you never know what's going to affect you from the outside. I did another show that was a limited run, Doug Henning's Wonderful World of Magic, and it was coming in for like a 2-month run, and it did so well that it ended up being 8 months. So every new month was a surprise. Like, hey, we're going to go another month. Okay, great. So that was actually a case where the meetings were actually good. Just got to keep moving and keep adapting and be ready for the next thing.
So when you were subbing, when you were first getting started, what were some of the things that you did that you realized were big mistakes that you realized you shouldn't have done? That if you were to tell somebody who wants to sub now, make sure you don't do these things.
That's an interesting question. Sometimes don't ask every question that comes to your mind. Sometimes you might ask a conductor a question and realize he doesn't know the music maybe as well as you thought he did. And he's mad at you for exposing that, and you never work for him again. I'm just saying.
No.
I've heard that might happen.
Wow, that's too bad.
So if something's really wrong and you want to ask about it, make sure you know what you're asking and you're asking the right person.
Okay. Okay.
I mean, it doesn't mean that if you have an F sharp and everybody else is playing an F natural, absolutely say, hey, should this be an F natural? Sure. Yeah, be judicious in your questions, and it's okay to figure things out yourself. That's one thing. Another thing is one of my philosophies is to always say yes and make sure that you want to accept the next adventure, and you never know what it's going to be. So I try to say yes to whatever comes my way that's exciting and worthwhile to work on. Every now and then we know we have some kind of conflict, and we say no. And most of us, being the business that it is, have experienced that conflict disappearing. And then you would have been able to do the job, or maybe the job shifts. I mean, don't tell somebody you can do something you can't do, but make sure you know how much you can't do it first, because when you say no, you really close the door. So if there's any way to say yes, if something works out, can I have another day? Or yes, I might have a conflict, but I'm pretty sure I can work it out. Whatever. If you can get away with something like that. There are many times when that would have been a good thing to do. And I learned to do that early on, and I did try to do it and work things out. And then sometimes you can work the other thing out and move things around, So don't cut yourself out of something that you want to do unnecessarily. Give yourself a little time to think about it and figure it out.
Think it all through before you say no,
right.
Basically.
Right. I've got a week for this guy. that wanted to sub for me, and I've got an emergency replacement on a show that I want to take. So I want to take that. I don't want to say no to this guy who's counting on me. Give me a few hours to see if I can work it out, something like that. Because you want to take the better thing, of course. And, the guy who you're committed to will understand that, but he won't understand you leave him high and dry if he's got nobody else. So you want to do as little damage as possible while taking as much as possible.
Did you find yourself to be a good networker when you first came? And do you feel that you're better at it now?
I didn't know what networking was when I came. You get more work from your colleagues who do the same thing than from anybody else, and more opportunities and more mentions. So your fellow drummers, your fellow percussionists, your fellow players are your network. And they will give you more work or send more work your way than anybody else. When your name is mentioned by one of them, it's always a good thing. And, people need to know, people ask us to do something, say, well, I can't do it, but I know these three people who could. That's super important. And I'm not sure I realized that when I got here, but I experienced it nonetheless. I met these guys that I started subbing for, and one of them, like I mentioned, Nick Serrato before, he was super helpful in sending some jobs my way, and in, giving me sub work, but also mentioning me to other people, and really helping me get into the scene, recommending me for recording sessions, things like that. So you never know who's going to be that person for you, and even if it only happens once, every step is a new step on the ladder that's worth taking. So yeah, it is really important. I mean, we are competitive, for jobs. We all are after the same jobs, but by the same token, we respect each other. It's a really interesting community. I mean, we have very quantifiable abilities, and no matter how much I want a job, I know you're a great drummer, and you deserve it. So I don't think we have that feeling of like, we may say, oh, I wish I'd gotten it, but we're not going to say, oh, I don't know why he got it, because we do know why. There's a lot of great players out there. I think that mutual respect is a really great part of the business, but it is an intriguing part, because the people who are our friends and our colleagues are also our competition. We all know that, and we all respect that whoever figured out how to get that next job did a great job. I sometimes do the Broadway percussion seminar down at NYU. You've probably done that, or if you haven't yet. You will one of these days. And it's fun and it's great, but I feel a little guilty, telling people that this is a possibility, because it's not a possibility for most people, frankly. There's a very limited number of slots. But something I don't feel guilty about, and that I try to bring to that, and I'll bring to this, is that theater work is great work, even if it's not on Broadway. There's a lot of great work out there. And, shows tour, and there are Broadway tours that go across the country. There are local theaters across the country. Live theater outsells all professional sports in this country by a big margin. And there's live theater everywhere. Not all of it has live music, but a lot of it in the big cities does. And there are a lot of jobs out there for people. I know people all over the country who make a fair part of their living playing shows in other cities besides New York. And in New York, there's also off-Broadway and off-Broadway. Off is usually bargain basement rates, but off-Broadway is usually decent, and you get some good playing experience. And sometimes there's a lot of shows. It goes up and down. You never know how many there's going to be, but sometimes there's quite a few out there. And there's other, there's regionals, and there's even theaters around here that people work at, close to New York. So there's a lot besides Broadway, and getting your theater chops together is valuable, even if you aren't one of the lucky ones. And, there's luck involved, absolutely. I mean, you have to have your skills together. You're expected to have a high level of skills. There's a lot of demands put on us. But there's also, knowing somebody at the right moment and having a little bit of luck. Not everybody's going to get it. And but there's other things to do out there. So musical theater chops are a great thing to have. While we're on that subject, can I divert for a moment? Because I want to talk about two of the things, since we're talking about that, what I think are the two most interesting divergent skills you need for Broadway. And they seem to be diametrically opposed. You need to be a great sight reader, because things we sometimes in rehearsals, in orchestra rehearsals, get stuff where we say the ink isn't even dry. I mean, they're bringing in the music as they write it, and pretty much most new shows I've done, we don't have the entire music at the first rehearsal. They haven't finished it yet. So you got to do some sight reading and get it to, and the rehearsal periods are short. You got to get it together quickly, and you're expected to have that ability. Then the show gets into the theater, and then 9 months later, you're still playing the same thing. So the other diametrically opposed ability is the ability to play the same thing over and over and make it feel fresh and exciting. And I think those two skills right there are kind of the crux of theater playing. Getting it together quickly and then doing it over and over and making it as exciting the last time as it was the first time.
How do you keep it fresh?
That's a good question. And it sort of depends on the music. Some music draws you in and is exciting over and over. Some isn't. and you have to make it fresh somehow, For me, there's always does this groove feel good? If a groove feels good, that's great. And it's exciting to play night after night. I don't have much of a problem thinking, can I get this groove happening with this band? And for other stuff, from the more orchestral stuff like mallet playing and timpani playing, it's a question of nailing it. And if the part is exciting, it's not hard to keep excited about it. If you counting to 17 and playing a bell note, that's a little different. That can be a little boring after the 25th time. I mean, it's a good question. That does take a little discipline. I find that after a really long time, you kind of start having your thoughts in your mind and remembering all the countries you visited while you play that triangle, and it kind of plays itself after a while. But there is a period between that, between reading and, the sort of involuntary memorization, where it's a little tough. You have to really remind yourself to pay attention.
Having a long career like you've had, how do you stay in shape and how do you avoid drumming injuries?
Tendinitis can rear its head, and various other injuries can rear their head. I had it kind of early on. I got a tendinitis problem when I was just doing everything I could do and practicing all night and playing the piano. And one day I put in an air conditioner in my apartment, and that put me over the brink, and my arms just gave up. And I had to take a couple of weeks off and went and did all you do for tendinitis. Eventually found acupuncture, which really saved me from that. But after that, I did some other things like Feldenkrais and a couple other things that were helpful to sort of relearn some motions and make sure that you can, for example, shake a tambourine without destroying your wrist and things like that. There are ways to really pay attention to kind of learning your movements in a non-injurious way. And it takes some extra discipline to kind of relearn some of those things that you might naturally do, but it's well worth it. So that's the main reason. And I do exercise every morning in flexibility exercises to keep all the limbs working as well as possible. And I think it's important that you have to have some kind of plan like that to stay exercised and stay active, because what we do is very physical, and you can't let the physical aspect get away from you.
So the skills that you have gained playing in pits, how does that transfer to playing with artists like Aretha Franklin or Art Garfunkel, Ray Charles, or those kind of people?
Well, it transfers more than you think, because when you're playing with those people, it's always a show. It's always a show with a beginning to an end. I mean, obviously, it's interesting you mentioned such different ones, because obviously Aretha Franklin is going to be a different groove than Art Garfunkel. And it's a question of latching onto the groove. For me, I love doing those kind of gigs, because if I'm playing with her, or a couple of her original musicians that she travels with, I'm going to learn how they groove together and get a new thing together, So I think the main question in that is to really keep your ears open and be open to the style that you're playing and try to absorb as much as possible. It's also good to, listen a little in advance if you get the chance, which you don't always. But in terms of the skills, especially for a percussionist, and I think this is probably true for a drummer too, one of the great things about Broadway is you play so many different styles. And you have to turn on a dime sometimes. You'll play, a funk tune and then a little orchestral tune and then, maybe a rock tune and then maybe a swing tune. And that could be act one, that happens sometimes. And sometimes you play a whole show with a swing feel, or a whole show with a rock feel, or a whole show with a chamber music feel. So the idea of that shifting style and being able to adjust to that and absorb all those and be able to have an output that includes all of those different styles is great. And the great thing about doing something, and I've played with a lot of people with a lot of styles, but since you mentioned Aretha, I think that's interesting because there's a very specific style. And to go play that style all night is so great. That's something that informs your show playing too, because now you can do that style a little more authentically because you had the experience of having a whole concert of it, So that's great. In terms of some of the other people, like Liza Minnelli and Barbra Streisand, are obviously showbiz world people who have done musicals, who are famous for being part of the musical theater. So working with them and working on Broadway are counter nourishing. They both nourish each other. Working with Liza was great because when I first started with her, the director for the act was Fred Ebb, and she does tons of Ebb, Kander and Ebb tunes. And Fred was the director, and got to meet him and work with him. And actually, one of my first shows, he wanted the band to come on one at a time, and he said, I want somebody to come on smoking. So who would? I want the second person to smoke. So who likes to smoke? I don't smoke. I never smoked. And I said, I'll do it. So I thought, well, I'll get on stage and I'll talk to Fred. That'll be great. So I came on with a cigarette and walked up to my platform, and then put it out and started to play. But that whole thing of being part of the show, and with Liza, we were on stage and being part of the show. So it's even more show busy than a Broadway show almost. It's like a big spectacle. And so doing things like that, and of course Streisand was the same, just on a bigger scale, a stadium scale. We were all on stage with a giant orchestra. But those things, they feed each other really well. And when you get to go play a singer and play their style for the whole night, it really gets to hone your abilities in playing in that way. But I think that's one of the things we do, and I'm sure you see this as a drummer. When you go and play with different people, you play a different way for different people. And it's great. And it's great to sort of realize how to get certain feels, and not just a feel for a song, but a feel for the whole night that sets that meets a certain expectation for that particular artist. And those skills transfer back to Broadway great, because, you might play a show where a lot of it is just kind of conversational music, and then all of a sudden there's one person who sings a killer blues number, and you're ready because you played with a blues artist and you know exactly what to do, So those skills feed each other really well, I think. Along those lines, I'm going to say one other thing, and that is another piece of advice I would give people is to not forget to do what you do. And by that, I mean, if you are a jazz player, go play some jazz. If you're a classical player, go play in an orchestra or play some chamber music. And then when you get called for the show that needs your particular skills, you're doing them and you have some experience with them. It's not just aspirational, A lot of times people get hung up in trying to get show work happening. And I understand it because it's good work and we all need a job that lasts a few weeks every now and then. It's important to keep playing the music you want to play so that you keep your skills up on the individual styles that you want to become known for.
Speaking of advice, you live in Midtown. if somebody is looking to get into Broadway and they want to move to New York City, what's one thing that you would tell them to know before they move to New York?
You know, New York is a lot of work, and you have to be committed. It's not an easy place to live, but it is.
Why is that? Why is New York not an easy place to live?
Let's see, a couple of reasons. It's expensive, it's crowded, and it's highly competitive. There's 100 people who want to do what you, well, 100. There's 1,000 people who want to do what you want to do. But it's very exciting, and it's the center of the action. And if you're a person who thrives on being at the center of the action, it might be right for you. But what's the hardest thing? The hardest thing is, at this point, the hardest thing is how to afford moving here and living here while you try to get things going. And you know, things change over time. So my path is not going to be the same as somebody's path today. But there are different ways to figure that out. I'm not sure I know what they are. That's not my area of expertise by any means. But I think that's the hardest thing is just getting a base of operations. One of the things that's hard about New York is there's not much room here. We tend to live in small spaces. And drummers and percussionists need a lot of stuff and need a place to play them. So that's why electric drum sets and malacats are very popular here, because we can put headphones in and practice and not kill the neighbors. I'm very fortunate here. I'm actually able to play pretty much anything as long as I don't do it, you know, it's from midnight to 6 a.m., I guess. But it's not always the case. I've lived in places where that certainly wasn't the case. But that's the hardest thing, is finding a place to live and work. And a lot of people get studio spaces, which is an added monthly expense, but have shared studio spaces, which I think is a great idea. I've done that in the past, and I'm sure a lot of people do that. I would say that's the hardest thing, finding an affordable place to live and to practice. But it's doable. And sometimes the places you go to practice, they may not be the prettiest places, but you know, they also might be a great place to meet people. And, you know, you never know. New York is so crowded that you never know who you're going to run into next, which is one of the great things about it. You can make connections when you least expect it.
You have behind you in this video, you have a mallet cat amongst other acoustic instruments. When the mallet cat and the rolling pads came out, did you see them as great tools, or did you see them as, oh my God, I can't believe we have to use these things? Like, was your approach of like welcoming or a shunning, like it was a virus?
I understand both of those reactions. I really do. And while both are somewhat true, my feeling was open. I thought it was fun. I had worked with some synthesizers early on, and I remember when Kurzweils came around, how excited everybody was about them. And I now, you know, later on, I would see the threat that things like that proposed, but early on, I thought, wow, this is amazing. You know, I got exposed to the mallet fairly early on. I know Mario DeQuitas well, the guy who runs Cat, and I've had my own cat for I don't know, a long time. This is actually my second one right here. But I thought it was exciting. I thought it was an exciting tool. One of the great uses, which I mentioned before, is that, you know, you can practice with headphones. So if you're in a place where you need to be quiet, you can do that. But in terms of a tool, the original one with sounds had some incredible sounds. Actually, they were Kurzweil sounds. That pairing disappeared after a little while, and my original sounds in that one, it lasted a long time, but they finally, the soundboard gave up. But I like the ability to be able to play different sounds on that. You know, it's interesting when you're practicing. Obviously, a vibe and a xylophone and marimba all feel very different when you're practicing on the real thing, and they have different size bars and everything. But when you have a malacat and you put on the xylophone sound, you play it different than when you play a vibe sound. You hear those sounds and your hands start to react like you know the instrument feels. And I have found it a more useful practice tool than I would have expected. I don't have to set up everything all the time. I can use that as a stand-in quite a bit. But in terms of using it on a gig, yeah, I've liked it. I've played Radio City. I won the Radio City audition a few times and got to play over there, and that was an all malacat, pancat, and drum cat book. So I got to explore the cats quite a bit. And I've worked with Mario and gotten into kind of some of the depths of the instrument a little bit. I've actually did malacat consulting on the Little Shop of Horrors on Broadway, however many years ago, 15, 20 years ago. I'm not doing that now. I'm not saying I'm an electronic genius by any means, but I know my way around the instrument, and I do like it. So I got excited about it. I was kind of open to it. I play in this band right now with Russ Annixter, his hippie big band, and it's basically playing vibes and xylophone and congas. But we did a gig at the bitter end, and there was not even close to room for vibes and xylophone. So we brought the malacat, and it turned out to be great. I really liked it with that band. So I use it sometimes in those kind of contexts, and it's great to be able to switch back and forth between vibes and xylo. I can do things I could never do with mallet changes.
Someone is listening to this. They're young. They're hungry. They want to get into Broadway. You've been in the business longer than I have. I have advice that I could share and some wisdom to share. I mean, you've shared a lot of great information already. What's one last thing some words of wisdom you'd like to impart upon those who are interested in playing Broadway, and what should they know that they might not know?
The first thing I would say is that the road to getting onto Broadway is subbing. And you need to, I don't know necessarily how to go about this in general, but you need to meet some of the players that you look up to or that are doing the scene and get to know them and get your information to them and whatever, and somehow find out a way to sub for somebody. And that is, generally speaking, the way most people get in the door. So the route to that is different for different people. You might know somebody, you might not. I don't think I really knew anybody when I came here, except not any players, but I knew one conductor who ended up opening a door for me. There's a lot of chance meetings. I get lots of people who called me and come and sat in and watched a show, and that's valuable to do too. I think just go meet some people, and when you go in, if you go and watch somebody play a show, even without the prospect of playing for them, you see a little bit about the scene, and you might meet other people. But basically, it's about meeting the right people to get you started subbing, because that is mostly the way it works. I saw your podcast with Mike Aarons, and there was a lot of interesting stuff in there about how to get in touch with contractors. And by all means, send them your information so they'll know your name. But that's not generally going to be your first entry into anything. I don't know many people who have been cold called for their first gig by a contractor before they've done any subbing or had any recommendations from any other people. So basically, understand that subbing is not only your key to getting in, it's also your key to staying in. Because when you do your show and it closes, you can stay in the scene and you can keep working by subbing. I often had periods where I was subbing 5 or 6 shows at the same time. And, if you look at that as exciting rather than a burden, then this might be the right place for you.
What kind of equipment do you use other than malacat? I know you are an innovative percussion stick endorser. Do you have any other endorsements? And why do you choose innovative as opposed to Vic Firth or Zildjian sticks?
Well, it's interesting because, like you, I am an innovative endorser and also a Paiste endorser. When I started playing Vibes, I started using Good Vibes mallets back when they were an independent company. And Good Vibes were like the greatest mallets ever made, I thought. Good Vibes Gary Burton model I used to use, and then the Mike Maneri model. They became harder and harder to find as they got sold to various different companies, passing through Vic Firth and Grover, I think, and somebody else. And they changed, and they became not the mallets I remembered. So I was looking for a place where I could, I actually went looking for a mallet company that I could, like their mallets and not pay a fortune to experiment with new mallets, but rather, have somebody kind of work with me and show me what they got. And I had, I was recommended them by my friend David Nyberg. He was with them for a little while, and he said, try these guys. They've been great for me. So I tried them, and I ended up liking their stuff quite a lot. I used to use, I like very bright bell mallets and xylophone mallets. I think that's been a part of my sound as long as I've been here. I think when people write for the vibe, for the xylophone and bells, they want to hear it and they want it to be bright. So finding the right mallet for that is difficult. And in Innovative, I found the OS4s were pretty much exactly right. They are bright and yet they're light enough to move around fast, and they're great. So they're sort of my go-to mallet, although I use many of their mallets. So I sort of sought out Innovative, and they responded, and we've had a good relationship. Paiste cymbals. I was on the Barbra Streisand tour. I started with her in '94, but at that point I had a sort of moderate endorsement with Istanbul. They weren't doing really a lot of full endorsements in those days, but I had talked to the guy and I had gotten some kind of arrangement. I actually went to the factory in Turkey because I was in Istanbul with Liza doing something, and picked up a bunch of cymbals there. And I had some great Istanbul cymbals. And when I started with JR, he was with Barbra Streisand. JR, John Robinson, was using Zildjians. And so when one of the Zildjians would come around, I would stand in front of my Istanbuls and vice versa. But then when we got a few tours later, I think it was 2006, JR had all Paiste cymbals. And I was commented on that. He said, "Oh, these are great. I've totally changed. This is my thing now." And the Paiste people came, and they offered me, and there was also a timpanist, Norm Friedman, and we had a sea of cymbals. It was a big setup. And they offered to supply all our cymbals. And I said, "Well, do you have anything like this Istanbul that I like?" And he said, "Well, no, but I try this. Maybe you'll like this." So I tried them under protest. I had about 6 different cymbals and a couple of Parapiatti. And by about the 3rd week, I would get up in the morning and think, "Wow, I can't wait to go hit that cymbal." They were addictive. I thought they were great. And ever since then, I joined up, and I've been whole hog. I probably have about 40 Paiste cymbals at this point.
Wow, that's great.
My wife thinks I have enough, but I'm not sure. But yes, I really like those, and those have become a part of my sound too. And it's great to find something that you can really relate to, that you feel is a part of your sound. Other than that, I have 2 Musser Pro Vibes, and I love that. Both of mine are fairly old when they sounded like the classic sound. I think the modern ones still sound really good. The body's a little different, but they're great instruments. I like those. And that's it. I have 4 drum sets, 2 vibes, 2 xylophones, 2 glocks, a marimba, gratales, congas. I use LP classic congas, Generation 2 bongos, and about 100 other things.
That's amazing. I have 1 snare, 1 cymbal. No, I'm just kidding. Where can people find you on the internet? You have a website, you have TikTok, you have Snapchat, Instagram.
I'm pretty bad with all that. I am on Instagram and Facebook, but I'm pretty low tech as far as everything else goes. But more coming soon.
No website?
I don't have a website, and which is ridiculous, but I should. I keep meaning to, but I'm too busy. that's my,
As
that's my excuse. I know everybody's busy and everybody does it, but yeah, I'll get around to it one of these days. I swear.
No, it's a good thing you're too busy. Stay busy and stay healthy. And it was great getting to know you and chatting with you, and great to hear your words of wisdom. I learned a lot today just speaking to you. There's a thing about speaking to people that have been in the business longer than me. They have a little bit different perspective than I do, and I find myself learning from everybody, but especially people that are seasoned vets like yourself.
Right. Well, thank you. And I feel the same way. I enjoy this conversation. I always learn from everybody too. I feel it's important to keep open and keep adapting as the business goes on. You know.
Indeed, indeed. Next time we see each other, hopefully it'll be on the Broadway campus in Midtown, or maybe on our own show.
Wouldn't that be great?
All right. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Bill Hayes, and we will talk. We'll talk soon.
Great, great, Clayton.